Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Stream, the only show that's really worth watching on a Sunday anyways. I hope that all of you are doing well as you all start to pour into the chat. I can already see that Dave is showing off with some truck emojis, and God bless the truckers of Canada and everything that they're doing. It is nice to see Trudeau and all of those that have just put so much hell on people to be afraid of their own popular sovereignty. So thank you all for tuning in. And yes, this was the lecture that I had planned for last week, but I had gone out that Sunday. So thank you all for understanding. And like I had said, there will be 2 frogs of the week for today to make up for last week, because that's what we're all here for at the end, isn't it? So today is going to be a little bit of back to basics. We'll be covering some theory, and we'll be covering a theory that actually not one that I think a lot of people on our side cover too much. A lot of us are sort of realists or Machiavellian, maybe in some essences. So I think today will be a very good time to cover the other side, the critiques of neorealism and neoliberalism. So, yes, Patrick Bateman says, greetings and salutations. Well, greetings and salutations to you all. And we'll just wait just a minute before everyone else starts pouring in. But yeah, we're going to have quite a bit in front of us today. So what are we constructing, says Steve. Well, we're doing social constructs, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Mono says, I hope that it was nice last Sunday. Well, I thought so. Hopefully it goes well for any future endeavors. But yeah, no, I thought it went well. So as we all pour in here, I will just quickly change the setup here so we can do this. And we will begin with the lecture very promptly now. So just a little bit of an outline. We're going to take a look at the concept that is often described in international relations as the state of anarchy in the world. Mainly just the famous quote that kind of comes with it that, anarchy is what you make of it, which is a lot of this has to deal with, interpretations, the social constructs of identity. How do we perceive ourselves? That's why I've got the lovely little kitten looking in the mirror over here. With, of course, the main criticisms that come with neorealism and structural realism, or, of course, neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So a lot of the neos, so to speak, if we want to make a Matrix reference, which we will, get introduced in this subject, where a lot of the constructivist thinkers are trying to provide answers as well as criticisms as to why some of these philosophies don't explain certain parts of the international order or why certain things happen that way. And then from there, we'll talk about social constructions, the power of ideas, how those ideas can change our perception of international systems. Of course, the quantitative versus qualitative view of things. And then some, rough looks and outlines of the constructivist views on foreign policy and some historical events with some final thoughts afterwards. I probably will in the future take a closer look at this lecture or this topic in the future, because much like with, say, neorealism, where there's a lot of scholars, this one is pretty more in depth, and it's more heavy on the sociological side, because we're going to be talking about, epistemology, ontology, and social identities. So this is going to be your bare bones dive into constructivism. And then when the stream is over, I'm going to link some articles for you guys to read and some easy explanations and primers, just so if you guys want to know more, that's available to you. Because, as always with the theory lectures, it's a really good way to understand things, but it's also a nice way to put it in practice with more literature. So like I've said in the past, it's always a good idea to get your understanding here. And if you want to know more, I will happily provide the resources for research. So let's dive in, shall we? So we'll have to start off with Anarchy, which I think is a really nice comparison to the Leviathan to the right. But of course, when we talk about international relations, especially in the current format of a lot of the present schools, whether you're a liberal, the liberal schools, including neoliberalism, the school of realism, constructivism, Marxism, feminism, rationalism, a lot of them do hold the belief, almost all of them, I believe, hold the belief that anarchy is the natural state of the world. There, of course, is no global sovereign. There is no global Leviathan. There is no global king that governs the way how the world operates. We talk about this all the time when we talk about realism, right? Where we always say that The world is anarchic. There's no global sovereign. God doesn't govern, upon the physical matters of the earth. Like, he's not physically here ruling over us with this rod and staff with the 24 behind him. So we have to be very, we have to rule and manage ourselves accordingly as nations. And of course, the realist perspective talks about how we have to provide emphasis on security, provide emphasis on power. The liberal view, of course, is to be like, well, we can mitigate this anarchy through institutionalism, through democratic means, through the populace. And the constructivists think a little different. Constructivists take the position that anarchy and international relations cannot be taken on empirical assumptions. So when we talk about the idea of these empirical assumptions, we talk about how international norms work. What are the concept of laws? Well, realists will say that these laws are based upon the ability to project power, or whether or not a nation wishes to pursue them in their own interests. The constructivists will look at this, for instance, and they will say something along the lines of, okay, but how do we determine those rules? How do we perceive the international system to be? It can't be just about power. We have to determine the identity for what these rules are. How do we construct the perception for how these rules are? Which, of course, gets the very famous quote from Alexander Wendt, one of the most prominent constructivist scholars. And in fact, he's still writing a lot of papers on constructivism to this day. When he wrote his original paper in 1992 in International Organization. Anarchy is what states make of it. And of course, the article is about the social construction of power politics. This is sort of an answer to the neo-realists. But anarchy is what a state makes of it. And of course, there's a lot of, in the time that I spent researching this, there's actually a lot that I find to be very true here. Our cultural identity, whether it's via ethnogenesis or an assigned set of values by elites, the way that we interact with the rest of the world, right, is based on those values and based on those identities. So, in a world where the realist perspective, right, is talking about the lines of, it's very, fend for yourself, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The way in which we define ourselves and pulling ourselves up that way plays a huge role in international relations from the lens of constructivist. I think in the future, what we might do for a later stream sometime, maybe after the event, we might start covering the responses and counter responses to everybody. But that kind of begs the question, though, right? Just what exactly on earth is constructivism? And so there's an international relations professor by the name of Caleb Gallimore, and he uses Neo from the Matrix, which I think is kind of funny because constructivism is a criticism of neo-realism and neoliberalism. But he says in this example that, Neo, of course, has the ability to see through everything and have the ability to change the rules at whim of the simulation that they live in. And of course, he's referring to the fact that some people, say, for instance, like Barack Obama or Donald Trump, and various world leaders in international systems, even like Eric Zemmour, right? They can change the rules better than others. The concept of how we perceive ourselves, perceive norms, perceive our identities, then in turn change our perspective on how we should engage with other nation states, how we should engage with other countries, and most importantly, how we govern ourselves, right? So like while Neo can stop the bullets and everything and change the traditional way that we think of firearms work, Eric Zemmour can use the party of reconquest or create a vision for what the French identity can be to change the rules for how not only states govern, but how they interact with other countries, right? The same thing could be said about the UK Independence Party. Farage and others within that backing can change the perception that, maybe this functionalist project of the European Union isn't working. Sovereignty matters more. So these ideas can shape the interests of a state, typically, of course, from a top-down basis when we understand things like democratic elitism or elite theory. But these state actors will then change the way that we view the world based upon how we, perceive ourselves and how we perceive our relationships to other countries. And a lot of this comes out of Cold War thinking, and I'll get into that in just a second here. But I see that everybody's honking in the chat, which is always lovely, and I'm sipping on my coffee from the Frog of the Week mug. But Wendt and other scholars, they press the idea of why couldn't neoliberalism, or why couldn't the emerging school of thought about neo and structural realism really explain the end of the Cold War. Why is it after this sort of, almost 70 years, right, of this, almost 70 years of this battle between constructivism, or between the new Soviet man and liberal, democratic, Western values of the United States, this idea of communism versus capitalism, what makes it come to an end? And constructivists posit that the neorealists and the neoliberals at the time couldn't provide an accurate articulation as to why, it ended. They said that it felt rather sudden, it felt rather abrupt. So why couldn't the other schools of thought explain the end of the Cold War? And we'll get to the end at the lecture, and we'll explain exactly how they, their own explanation is. So the emergence of constructivism. So there's Professor Alexander Wendt on the right. He works a lot now with various forms of sociology and computer science, but he's still a political scientist at heart. So the school of thought, of course, emerges in the late 1980s, probably, I believe, around 1988. But Wendt really starts taking it off in the early 90s after the wall falls. And it is, of course, a critique of neoliberal and neorealist thought. So the major critique that Wendt makes, and this is, and I will actually, I will probably provide a link in the description afterwards to his original paper, is that there are no initially set structures or limitations to the world. So the rules in which we govern ourselves by on the international stage, we have to, of course, the common argument is that, well, we have to do it through the power projection, through power politics. Understanding the dynamics between powerful nation states and using our interests and using the rules of that international system to, lend favor into our system, or lend favor to our nation. Wendt argues that the international system is not necessarily a system, but a process that we construct through our own interpretations of how the nation should interact with the world and how we should interact with other states. We recognize that certain nations are friends because we can easily construct by this relationship that we're not on a friendly basis. But we can also tell when someone isn't being belligerent, and we can possibly work with them. These are based on, mutual understandings of these constructs, mutual identities where there's some congruence or overlap in values. And which means, really, to some extent, that the international order is not, the unwritten rules that it abides by are constantly changing. So when, say, as the meme goes, right, when realists in the international relations school talk about international norms, or they talk about international law, but when they really talk about norms, the constructivist kind of perks up, and he notices that they're talking about, things that are socially constructed. The principal argument, as it's told from constructivism, and if you have studied any sociology, you might already know where I'm coming from, is that our entire worldview is based upon these social perceptions and social constructions on our interactions with others, our interaction in society, and in turn, the rules that we, lay claim to in, say, realism. Aside, I think, maybe from geography, but you can even counter that in just a minute, that, there are no unwritten rules to abide by. We create them, and we create them through these ideological perceptions of the self, of the government, of the nation. And in fact, in reference to earlier, Professor Gallimore had said that, if everyone tomorrow, just on a whim, through whether you want to just say like a hypnosis or whatever, just immediately stopped believing that the United States existed as it currently did. They stopped believing that it was a democratic republic. They stopped believing in the Constitution. They stopped believing that Barack Obama was the president, because that's at the time that his little spiel was recorded. Essentially, America, as we know it, would disappear. And not because, the physical aspect of the country, right, is gone, but because the ideological aspect, the identity, the social construction of what America is, its values, its performance, its society, all disappear because we stop putting faith, we stop believing in the socially constructed identity that comes with it. And as Mr. Walrus points out, we do live in a society. And if you haven't subscribed to Mr. Walrus already, you should. He puts up some fantastic lectures and observations in Scandinavian politics, I believe in Norway. So by all means, give him a view. But yeah, so because there are no initially set structures and our belief in, say, the values of a nation, these rules significantly change. And because of this, identity and meanings assigned to things of various variables and state actors, these all change our perceptions of how we view IR. So whether it's over cultural issues, linguistic disputes, how we conceive and perceive ourselves, most often, like I mentioned, from a top-down basis of those who naturally rise to the top or already a part of the elite or aristocracy, those values then in turn affect the way that nation or that group comes to there. But I noticed that we're beginning to respond to Mr. Galliamore. Steve says that new societies would form immediately. Yes, but if we all stopped believing in this, what would the new society be? Would it be based on new perceptions, new identities? This is why Wendt and other constructivists, there's even some schools of thought that are like constructivist realism, which I think we might look into in the future, that argue that, yeah, new societies would absolutely form immediately, but what would they be based on? A new sense of identity? Would they come out? This is why they argue that the international system or political systems are not so much physical, quantitative systems that we can measure and predict and tell you how they operate, but rather instead are about the idea that it's a process, that are constantly changing forms of identity or belief or values that are instilled to us through cultural diffusion, or of course by new people coming in, for instance. They would be the ways in which it becomes a process, not just a system. But you're right, new societies would form immediately. Glow in the Dark says the natural counter to this seems that the material conditions would result in the U.S. just recreating itself, even if space aliens or whatever make everyone stop believing in it. Potentially, but again, it would be if we stopped believing in it and if we decided to make something else. What would that be? And potentially, it could be very similar to the U.S. or rebirthing itself. In a way, the constructivists, maybe from a sociological standpoint, would say that, yeah, the United States as it was in, say, 1789 is not the same America as it was again. In fact, to an extent, you'll get people like Curtis Yarvin saying that we're on like the fifth American Republic, or even more neoconservative George Friedman type saying that there are these like strange 50-year cycles where the country reinvents itself. But yeah, I mean, but again, I think it reiterates the idea that it's a process. It's not a set system. We have things that are nominally in place, right? But the material conditions allow us to have a process. But and as Walrus also states, in Guinan terms, a society of being of quality cannot be defined by numbers alone. Our managerial elite would like it to be one of quantity, line go up ism, etc. Yeah, that's something that we'll actually talk about in just a minute when we talk about quantitative versus qualitative, the ontology and epistemology study. And then Suspicious Minds asks, what has Huntington said to this school of thought? I actually don't know if Huntington had written any articles or provided observations on constructivism. I bet you that reading from the Clash of Civilizations, which was published in 1996, I would bet that he's probably taken a lot from this. I mean, like he says, he has these civilizational and cultural identities. So I would argue that he probably built a lot from the constructivist school, but he's also rather realistic in his interpretations of them. So that's actually a really good question, Suspicious Minds. I might just go from there and take a look. But Ko-Fi says, people just don't stop believing in their society's narrative, though. No, which is why I was saying that this is probably from a top-down process that we would change it, where we fundamentally transform the country, as others would note, like that of Barack Obama. He was providing just a rather wild example within the video, just saying that we have people that can change these norms and change their rules based on perceptions. You're absolutely right. It's a little outlandish that we all stop believing in the country tomorrow. But again, I'm referencing just sort of how he opens. But again, process versus structure, and the qualitative versus the quantitative. So, realism and liberalism are viewed as positivist interpretations of international relations, that it is based on observable fact, that laws are quantitative social rules, and that we have a good idea of the fact that these laws and these orders are derived down from an authority. And which is why I mentioned earlier that constructivism in international relations relies heavily upon sociology and sort of the sociological ideas of constructivism, which you could argue is very interpretivist in terms of how they view themselves, which is why I have on the right here this sort of positivism versus interpretivism sort of differences in when it comes to sociology. They consider sociology to be a science from the positivist view. Behavior is explained by cause and effect relationships. It's quantitative. We believe that there's observable, empirical, facts and details and data that we can measure and that we can record that provides expectations for how people might act or how societies might act, or by extension for international relations, right? How nation states might react. A realism is heavily based on this concept where we understand that states have certain powers. And you can see this throughout the tragedy of great power politics, right? With Mearsheimer, because he spends a lot of time outlining, various nations' militaries throughout history. What were their numbers projections? Why is the army, like a ground force, so important? And how do nation states react to these relationships when they're starting to pursue power in this anarchic state? And what we can expect nations to do within that lens. Again, very positivist. Whereas constructivists, very much like how the interpretivists view themselves, that things can't necessarily be measured, that behavior is explained by, various forms of free will, not external causes, such as, say, other nations taking action. It's qualitative. There's subjectivity and understanding, and we can apply this subjectivity and sort of the causes that would change someone's behavior or change how a nation reacts in the way that we kind of understand elite theory. That, we do have a dedicated set of elites, and you do have managers that help propagate the system of those beliefs into a way in which government functions. And of course, that in turn we can measure its effects, right? But we can't necessarily measure what might be in their interest or why they do the things that they do right at the top. So it makes it for an interesting, difference here, that it's not necessarily cause and effect. It's more about the social interaction, mainly from the top down, which you could say is a little different from interpretivism because it is an external cause, especially when talking about elites. But again, when we talk about like international relations and such, right, especially within these schools and these lenses, I don't think that there's like a dead set, one school has all of the answers, which is why we try our best to cover things on this channel that aren't necessarily within my worldview. Like for me, for instance, I take a far more realist approach on things, but I know that realism doesn't have an explanation for everything. And I do have to rely on other scholars or other perspectives, which is why I find this constructivism so interesting, because yes, there's a lot of aspects of social constructs, especially from the top, right, that come down, do so. And Dave Bergeron mentions in chat, I think that both are necessary. And I think that you're right, Dave, there are. And in fact, there's an article I was reading last week and prepping for this that was called Constructivist Realism that I really want to finish reading, because I think that there's a lot to it that would be beneficial to maybe expand my worldview, but also to see how these two synthesize. But again, the constructivists argue that the international system is based on all nations sort of projecting a social construct, and that the way then we interact with it is based upon sociological beliefs, based on the process of our political identity, our social and cultural and ethnic identities, all play a role in how the nation perceives itself. So think Ernest Renan, what is a nation? And how that nation should interact with the rest of the world, and how should it be seen by the rest of the world. These perceptions matter. These social constructs of what make a nation matters. And so in 1992, as I mentioned earlier, Wendt starts making this argument that rationalism doesn't necessarily work on behaviors, but rather, that our argument doesn't work. Our change on behaviors should be focused on identities. And in fact, I think I can bring up the quote here. Yes. He says this, quote, "As such, rationalism offers a fundamentally behavioral conception of both process and institutions. They change their behaviors, but not identities and interests. In addition to this way of framing research problems, neorealists and neoliberals share generally similar assumptions about agents. States are the dominant actors in the system, and they define security in self-interested terms. Neorealists and neoliberals may disagree about the extent to which states are motivated by relative versus absolute gains, but both groups take the self-interested state as the starting point for their theory. End quote. So he's arguing that because they focus from the state and they say that the state focuses it, it ignores the populations inside that state that help set up the ways in which our identities are constructed. It ignores how, various groups of either the wealthy or the politically inclined or religious movements can definitely shape our ideas in our society towards the creation of how nations assess those needs. How does a nation assess the need to project power? And a lot of that, he thinks, comes from it. Suspicious Mind says the problem with the constructivist thinking is that they can't know what is foundational without breaking everything. And it was funny because the video from Galliamore that I was citing earlier is that he actually says that. He says, because if you start thinking about everything, right, the very foundations, why is something red? Why is the stop sign red? Why do we cross the street a certain way? Why do we drive on the road a certain way? He says that you'll break your brain. And he says, well, and I think he finishes the little short video. It's like 5 minutes long, where he just sort of gives a little breakdown. And he says something along the lines of, yeah, that's the point, is that sometimes you have to break your break your brain a little. So yeah, no, Suspicious Minds, you kind of, brought it up all on your own, something that he also brought up. And Algernon says, there's a book on my list by James Wakefield on Giovanni Gentile and the contemporary constructivism. Looks slightly cloaked in OPSEC language, but it is interesting. Well, I'll have to look it up. But yeah, so this is what he's focusing on, is the process versus structure. Do we just view things from a structure, but what about the process that gets us to there, which in turn can change how structures operate in the international system or how nations change their perspectives of things? And like I said, there's a lot of depth into this. I'm trying to give the most bare bones interpretation to it because there's just a lot of literature here, and I would need to read a lot more sociology because I only took maybe 2 semesters of it for university. So I would have to come back to it for sure. But I do find this really interesting about how we generate these perceptions of the state and how the state should be perceived. But one of the big things that the constructivists focus on is ontology and epistemology. So the very nature of reality and the very nature of, in research, how that operates as well. The study of knowledge and the study of reality are a key aspect to constructivist thinking and literature. So ascribed meanings help determine the existence of things in the now. So how we currently perceive things allows us to have a good definition and a working operation for how these structures are. But let's see. And so, for instance, right, when you hear, actually, this was very funny. Someone before I went live had sent a message to me on Telegram, and lo and behold, it's Tay Zonde of all people. And if those of you who know your internet lore, yes, that's the gentleman who sung Purple Rain. And he was giving a brief explanation of his perspective on cryptocurrency. And he was talking about the dollar and the fiat system and how we assign it in value and faith. So it has an ascribed meaning because we're socially constructed to believe that that's what it's happening, right? And that's how we operate. So the way that we, ascribe a meaning ourselves to the state, to the nation, to the people, those that, we associate with or that we consider our friends, help us determine the existence of things that are in the now. So yeah, no, you're absolutely. It's very funny. I thought the Tay Zonde thing was actually kind of very applicable for our conversation today. But no one asks, why are there only these 2 theories? Neither seem complete or correct. And it's not that there are these 2 theories. In fact, if you were to open up realism, right, there's like multiple schools of thought inside realism. You have neo-realism, which is also sometimes known as structural realism. And inside of that, there's offensive and defensive. There's classical realism. There's neoclassical realism. And then there's just OG realism. The liberal school of thought has like functionalism, neo-functionalism, neoliberalism. I'm covering a very broad tent here because, When you say these two theories, there's actually a lot more. There's like rational choice theory. There's realism as a theory. There's constructivist theory. Marxism even has their own theory, I think, under like Wallerstein's world systems analysis. So neither one is complete or correct. I would absolutely agree with you 100%, Manoan. But there are some theories that provide a better understanding for how the system works today. Others provide maybe an older view, and say like classical versus today's neorealism. So you're right. It's not that there are two. One is ever going to be the dead set answer. And in fact, I would say beware the man with one book, because if you've only got one book to define your entire worldview, it'll be a little narrow, don't you think? Which is why I think it's very important that we always try to, ensure we have a pretty holistic understanding of how the world works. But to take a look at the other stuff here. Let's see here. Other questions, because I like that you guys ask questions during the lecture. It lets me think, and I can hopefully provide a response in the talk. King of Games asks, Prudentialist, does constructivism address some of the effects of hypermodernity and the effect of global reterritorialization and liquefaction through the WWW on FP today? I would have to... Are you talking about like Foreign Policy Magazine? I can quickly look that up. Foreign Policy Magazine. I don't know what WWW is, but I mean, we can definitely take a look at that in a minute. But I mean, in terms of constructivism addressing the effects of, say, deterritorialization and reterritorialization, yes. In fact, those words have been seen in some of the things that I was researching. So yeah, they definitely do address those issues. But yeah, no, we'll address all other schools of thought in terms of IR. We'll touch base on Marxism. We'll touch base on some feminist thought. We'll touch base on, it's probably, essentialism is a different philosophical concept, but if they've got an IR theory, we'll definitely cover it. But again, back to the lecture. I've diverted a little too much on this tangent. So for those of you listening, I apologize. But again, so the question becomes, and this is why ontology and epistemology are so important, is why do we assign meanings to the things that we do assign them to? And again, it goes back to that sort of breaking your brain a little, because you're questioning the foundations, you're questioning the ontology and the epistemology for why we view the world this way. Why do we look at the knowledge that we've constructed the way that we do? And to bring it back to Statecraft, it kind of comes back to that aspect of formulation of identity. So, for instance, if we want to identify who our friends are, who are our enemies, constructivists would argue that you can probably get a good idea based on how your social constructions and your state values and identities are. So when we talk about like the Cold War, a way that a constructivist would give you a very basic explanation would be something along the lines of, well, of course, Western Europe doesn't turn against the United States when the Cold War begins, because they do have similarly aligned values, and they recognize that the power of the two great powers at the time, the Soviet Union and the United States, that one is more closely aligned with their ideological and their social constructions of the self, although you can argue that France is a little different throughout the course of the Cold War, right, with NATO and the empty chair crisis. But it does illustrate, of course, why congruency is necessary with others. So, I mean, for instance, right, like I noticed someone in chat earlier had mentioned aliens or something like that. So say aliens, or we discover a new species of sentient creatures or whatever, and we're now trying to engage diplomatically. If they have no if they have no understanding of like the social construction of a state, the social construction of a democracy, the social construction of diplomacy, foreign ministers, or having consulates on other countries, how on earth do you begin to even conduct diplomacy with these people, right? It would be almost impossible, because you would have to start from literally ground zero and start providing an understanding of the ontology and the epistemology for how we view the world, how we view nations, how we view the, science of diplomacy between countries. You'd have to teach them just about everything, right, to make it work, which to me makes it very interesting and very unique on that subject, because This is what I think, in a way, provides us a good understanding, because if one nation's values are so fundamentally foreign or alien to another, it does make diplomacy rather difficult, or the ability to understand how one nation governs can sometimes make your request very different. And in fact, it's also why we have rules in place to not talk to various uncontacted peoples here on Earth. And I think Tuesday just pointed out, this is basically why we leave the Sentinelese alone. Absolutely. No one wants to end up like that Rockefeller kid back in the, I think, the 60s. Mark Collins says, aliens, just say the left. Well, for the sake of the argument today, I mean, the social construct for nation states and diplomacy, but I mean, at the same time, you could even put it on a micro level, not just macro, where yes, we have different social constructs for how cultures, peoples, systems of governments operate. So yeah, it does make it almost fundamentally foreign to interact with someone, which could cause belligerency, or at greater risk, you actually increase the likelihood of the security dilemma. Which again, we're kind of seeing that happen right now with the Ukraine situation, is that these different constructions of the nation in turn make it very difficult for us to have congruent understanding for what we want to accomplish. So if the US regime, right, and I say regime because I don't want to necessarily identify with it, I certainly don't, but if the US regime wants to, say, try and get Ukraine into NATO for the purposes of primacy and containment, because, values, markets, democracy, things that it assigns constructed to itself, and it has no real relationship to why that's an issue, or why the Russian Federation views this as an existential threat, then it does increase the security dilemma. And that's why we've seen all these conflicting reports about, whether they're moving blood or not, how much troops that they're moving. And there are people that are just looking in the background being like, this is just a great miscommunication on a global scale. And of course, not just miscommunication or misalignment of values, but also like purposeful advances that could easily escalate things. Suspicious Mind says, it seems like a reverse engineering of statecraft, which is odd considering we have enough literature to understand how we got here. The constructivist question can be solved with knowledge. And I think that's kind of why they study epistemology and ontology so much, is because if you wish to understand things or why we get to where we are, we have to understand those ontological and epistemological foundations. I don't think that it's necessarily a reverse engineering statecraft, but it's providing answers to statecraft questions that, say, the realists or the neoliberals don't. Constructivists today, I mean, there's a really good video about the different schools of thought explaining the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And they give you wildly different answers, from the neoliberals to the realists to even the constructivists will tell you about the socially constructed aspects of feeling attacked and lashing out at those that have threatened America, or, that are laid claim to things like weapons of mass destruction. Which, of course, this is at the time, right, 2003. But of course, looking back, I think for those of us in these circles, right, with an understanding of elite theory, you can say that, well, those things are from like top-down perceptions. There are ulterior motives in mind that's disseminated. The social attitudes change, which is why I find this subject to be really interesting. Because you could argue, yeah, there's probably a reverse engineering of statecraft, but it's also trying to provide a different lens and through which we understand the states. But yeah, and again, that congruency matters a lot in how we engage in relationships with other countries. I'm just going to finish my coffee here real quick before it gets cold. Alrighty, so let's continue. So again, this kind of brings us now to the constructivist thought in foreign policy. Which we've started talking about here. So they try and provide an explanation to the Cold War, which I find rather interesting. So the social constructivist argument is about identity shaping interests, which, can be accounted for when, say, you factor things like interdeterminacy, like how neorealism does. So when we talk about like the Cold War, I mean, of course, Western European powers aren't going to be balancing against the United States, but they go with her because they understand themselves as democratic capitalist states nearer to the U.S. identity than they would, say, authoritarian, or communist states that would be enshrined by the USSR. And even before this, right, you had various racial identifications, right? The idea that, there's a European identity in here, or there's a white identity in here, between the U.S. and European powers after the Second World War, which is different to, say, the Eastern European or the Slavic aspects, or all the various identities that can be combined into what is called the Soviet man. And so this, of course, leads to a multilateral system of alliances, and then maybe bilateral ones in Southeast Asia. Of course, attempts to get into Africa and South America throughout the Cold War. While neorealists, of course, will argue that there are, material power threatens powers necessary but not sufficient to do so. The other argument is from the constructivist side that the meaning of power is interpreted. It's not just assigned. It's not pre-given. What we consider to be threats by states are not just from material conditions, but they're also based on socially constructed ones, whether it's by ideology. And you can see this a lot through propaganda, right? This is how I think constructivism provides a really unique way of talking about, say, like the manufacture of consent that gets talked about from Lippmann or Chomsky, because if you can construct a idea of someone being the enemy, you have a very good way of understanding, that they're going to be dehumanized, that they're the other. It's a sort of a good way to do so. And since everyone's talking about coffee, no, I had got coffee from Buc-ee's. So that stuff's the best in my personal opinion. I've had a lot of coffee, but that's pretty good. Although French press coffee is also fantastic. It just depends on what kind of grounds you buy. But as Dave Bergeron points out, every nation does have a different identity. But again, like I mentioned earlier in today's lecture, it's about that congruence. If your nations have somewhat of a congruent social construction, so for instance, like liberal states are more inclined to be socially engaging with one another over, say, illiberal states, that can help focus your foreign policy and your relationship with other countries. And in fact, that's something that throughout my readings, I know not too long ago, we talked about, we had a great stream with Mr. Mandrill, who's telling me that Stocking Mill coffee is the best coffee. I should probably order some and put that to the test. But Mr. Mandrill and I covered Barry Posen's Restraint. And one of the things that we talk about in there is that these socially constructed narratives can determine how a state assesses its grand strategy. So in one way, it would be along the lines of the United States and what Posen calls, and what I actually agree with, is called liberal hegemony, sometimes also known as the global American empire, is that you have the issue of, okay, what are our socially perceived threats? One of them is the aspect of illiberalism. That's considered one of the biggest issues when it comes to liberal hegemony, according to Posen. And in fact, way back in 2009, when I very first read The Next 100 Years, that's something that even Friedman points out, although his idea of grand strategy was just prevent one nation state from challenging you. Posen illustrates this, right, that it's, of course, dealing with illiberal states. You want to have a amount of alliances who's ideologically more aligned with you. This ensures primacy. And of course, that's where we sort of get liberal hegemony, 1941 onward. But yeah, you have to group them in this way. So when we're talking back to the Cold War in these ideological instances, the critique that neorealism provides is that, there's also so many ways in which it can play out. It's not always going to be perfect. The constructivist argues that identities shape preferences. And of course, in my perspective of it, the identities of the elites, or what is in the elites' interests that are socially constructed by the elites, will shape preferences. And of course, there are multiple identities because there are multiple elites or multiple people in positions of wealth and influence that can do this. And in turn, the constructivists argue that the end of the enduring rivalry between the United States and the USSR was due to Moscow under Gorbachev conceiving the USSR as a normal, social, democratic great power rather than a communist superpower. And this is from Hoff in 2016. He argues that the ideation ingredients of this new identity have been around since Khrushchev's governments, but were increasingly cemented by the preliminary success and subsequent disenchanting demise of the 1970s rapprochement between the US and the USSR. And that's sort of his argument, is that these changing constructions and perceptions from elites in turn change state actors. And it kind of goes back to that thing that the professor had mentioned at the beginning, Caleb, where he says that, people like Barack Obama, that certain men, certain positions in power, their social constructions, their social perceptions can have a great impact on the international order and how a nation governs themselves. So you can't look at it purely by material means. And while material means can certainly create back a way to do that, the environment that they come in allows their perceptions to be viewed and can come back to their to making their decisions. And again, there's a really good video talking about all these various scholars that I think I'll try and look up and link in the chat here real quick, that discusses sort of like the American response to Iraq and Afghanistan, that you had people in power more based on the perception of being attacked. The national polity, had this now identity of anti-terrorism. Of course, by 2003, things changed vastly different, because it's not like Afghanistan. There's anti-war protests, but it is pulled through ahead. And for instance, constructivists would argue that there is, based upon identities of a perceived threat, mainly liberal democratic states that form a coalition led by the United States, that go forward and take it on, and in turn push forward and lead a new anti-terrorism policy. That's how you get ISAF. That's how you get these things that lead into the invasion. And of course, like I have pictured up here, you've got the AUKUS agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia. Talking about this new strategic alliance with submarines, naval communication, things like that. The special relationship between the UK and the United States is based upon social, constructs and perceptions of identity that are based upon how we view ourselves. Do we have similar things in mind? We come from a common ethnos, or at least we did. And all of which puts it in a position to facilitate a relationship that affects global powers on, of course, an international scale, because you have material power, a shared identity, your social constructs of how the world should be governed are very similar, whether via imperialism or by aligning yourself with other Anglospheric states. Again, an emphasis on the special relationship, providing a way that our constructs can do so. And Dave Bergeron says that China has anti-terrorist policies as well. They've even built, places for them. And I think that also has a lot. And that's actually an interesting thing that we might want to do and apply this theory, or this school of thought, towards state policy. If the fact is that China, for instance, the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, it's primarily Han Chinese. What, of course, is in the interest of any state? It is to secure its territorial sovereignty and to ensure that there is no internal disruptions to sovereignty and your ability to lead and your ability to govern. All of which, right? And yes, superphrase, I do mean school of thought. There's a variety of theories that buy under this. I was mentioning this earlier, but yes, it's a school of thought. But yeah, like Dave's got a point. Like, Han Chinese have a social perception of the self. It's socially constructed. The elites manage to put things out. And we've seen this already happen throughout the turn of the century, whether it's over Tibet or now what's happening in Xinjiang, all of which plays a major role in the ability to conduct that state's policy, how it perceives itself. And I've mentioned it on other streams as well, the concept of a civilizational state. It all sort of plays into there. But these constructivist thinkings, of course, there's various theories that lie underneath. I'm providing a very broad baby's first steps into the school, is that, the social constructs should help explain how we perceive material items, the material conditions of a state. And in fact, even realists talk about materialism a lot, like what is available to you, what are your natural resources, what's the human capital, what's been the historic trend, all of which, right, can be, again, prescribed or ascribed meanings to those things, which helps determine a nation's policy. So those are just some examples. And I do think as I read more, we'll actually start going into individual theories in the future, because things like constructivist realism, constructivist liberalism, they all play a very interesting role here on how to help explain things. And as I think Manuela mentioned earlier in chat, you can't get just one singular school of thought or one singular theory to provide every single answer in international relations. The world is too large and too complex for that, but it doesn't hurt for us to study and have a good idea of how it works and operates. So to give some final thoughts and to get towards the end of today's lecture before we catch up with everybody, and I have some announcements for you all, and there's a variety too. Constructivism, well, of course, is related to critical theory and more sociological leanings, and I know that there are many of us on the right that kind of like either recoil or get a little, eyebrow raised when we talk about critical theory. These things, I think, offer a very unique lens to understand foreign policy. And I think by extension, and I've mentioned this throughout our conversation today, has been about how the social constructions of the elites, whether how they come to the determination of what their interests are or what they would like to accomplish, how they stop another rival, how do they perceive the foundations for their worldview, in turn can reflect upon the nation, which either leads to the manufacture of consent or, of course, allows them to take action that the population may not necessarily want, or at least don't see it as within their own material interests. We see this a lot sort of with American foreign policy to some extent. But I find that it's a really unique way to look at the world, or at least in terms of statecraft, because trying to understand where these concepts come from provides, say, sort of ethnos, or what's considered to be like sociogenic changes, or at least changes with sociogenic origins, or even the fact that some nations have a perceived ethnic identity and others don't, and they claim to be more based upon values. All of which, right, provides a very interesting way to look at how nations interact. Because if we can understand where these social constructs come from, we might have a better idea of how these various state actors and their elites, and those who are in government, those who are in the foreign ministry, those that are a part of a new administration, they look at the world and engage with it. If these ideas can then in turn, shape the world, like I mentioned, they must come from some various forms of elites within government and within industry. And in fact, the social perceptions of, the cathedral, things that Yarvin was writing about in the open letter back in 2007. He doesn't talk about his sort of Protestant Calvinism issues as much, but I mean, he was trying to offer, I think, a rather sociological understanding for where progressivism comes, which he thinks is sort of this like hyper Protestantism, but a lot of neo-reactionaries blame. But I don't buy into that as much. I think it kind of, there's a variety of things, but I don't think you can identify a singular reductive root cause. I find root cause debate to be very reductive and boring. But I mean, the other criticism, though, that I do have of it when they talk about rules or perceptions is that they change. Like, sure, some rules change based upon perception, but there are some things that you can't change. You can't change the fact that you're a landlocked country. I mean, you can try, but good luck with that. You can't change the fact that, there's no oil or copper or uranium underneath your soil, or even like water reservoirs, right? Like that stuff can't change. Those rules are intrinsic, like the rules of geography or the rules of natural resources of what's available to you change. The same thing with like how many men at arms do you have or your population. You can socially perceive yourself to like, okay, we must construct a more peaceful identity. We clearly don't have the capabilities to be offensive. Defensive realists will argue that that's the reason why, based upon material conditions, nations enter like economic or defensive alliances. But what I find interesting is also that, you can socially have a construction of yourself, of an ethnos or of a people, which can lead to things like the concept of Lebensraum, right? Seizing the Sudetenland. Things in which nations and their leadership, most importantly, have a social perception of the people, have a perception of reclaiming glory, feeling that they have been slighted, and are doing so. And I think that you can even apply to that with Russia to some instance, where, yes, there are various territories that have vast amount of ethnic Russians, particularly like that inside eastern Ukraine, where you have the Donetsk and the Donbass region with Russian separatists. Or the importance that Russia, has a social construct of what it is, that it is of once a Russian empire, and you have the Kievan Rus, right? And why Crimea is so important historically as a port, not only for Russia, but also because it's an area to get access to the Mediterranean. All of that plays an important role in which how these things change and how we perceive the international order, and how our perceptions and how we perceive ourselves to have power also affects how other nations perceive that as well, which is why it can affect things like the security dilemma, which is how it can affect how nations garner up various groups or alliances or a plurality, the United Nations General Assembly and things like that, all of which plays a role here. So I don't think that this school of thought is going to give you like a one-step shot for answers, but it does put itself out there, I think, in a way where it lets you understand some aspects for why elites think the way that they do, why statecraft happens the way that it does. And that's why I find this stuff rather interesting in this instance. But yeah, suspicious mind, critical theory, but based. Yeah. All of these things that come into mind. And then Big Nig 420, thank you so much. I love reading names now about these things. 6.99 Canadian, has some shekels, brother. Well, thank you. I'm always appreciative of these things. All of these funds will probably go to the very fun event coming up next month. But yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts, and I think that we'll start in the future, because the more I'm reading about it and the more I keep looking into it, the more I actually really, really want to start looking at these, like constructivist realism, constructivist Marxism. These theories seem very interesting. I think it'll be a really good way to take a look at just what the school of thought is, because this is a very broad, tipping your toe into the water at the pool, so to speak. So those are my thoughts, and I find this stuff really fascinating, because while I'm more of a realist in that tradition, and I've read a lot more realist literature, reading about other schools of thought always provide unique answers to things that I don't have an answer to off the top of my head. So that would be the conclusion for today's conversation. So some announcements. So that I'm going to put some video projects on the back burner or on the backlog. Like I mentioned in the community tab, that I've seen a lot of videos about certain transplant patients or those on the list being denied because of their needlecraft laws and things like that. So as you can obviously tell, it's a rather personal subject for me. I'd like to talk about it and be rather thorough and frank. So that'll be the one that I'm working on. As for this week, let's see. I believe it'll be this Thursday and Friday. I'll be particularly busy. Thursday will be with Scrump and Evelyn. We'll be talking about geopolitics and various forms of elite theory that play into that. So actually, it's kind of a good thing that we talked about constructivism today in the schools of thought. And then on Thursday as well, I should be with Lambda again, talking about ascetics in Christianity. Because when he originally messaged me, before we get to that, can't tease you there. But before we get to that, I'll start talking about, our original message was about just the aesthetics of things, how things look and whatnot. Not the ascetics like people who have limited possessions, consider themselves mystics and things like that. So we're doing both, and that'll be this Thursday. And then on Friday, I'll be recording a conversation about Ukraine over at Imperium Cast. I don't know when it'll come out. It's recorded and then edited and then brought up as a premiere. So yeah, it'll be there. It'll probably be out sometime next week. So yeah. Currently working on my speech. I'll be speaking at the event, so there are tickets still available. Will do, so don't you worry if you haven't caught it yet. But yeah, things to do. And so people are asking for reading recommendations. What I will do is that everything that I have done research on, or that I have done, when the stream's over today, I will update the description, so you have access to all of that as a bibliography with JSTOR links and videos and explanations and things like that. So you can add it to your reading list or things. Oh, just author and title. Well, then, yeah, some of the journals and some of the things that I've read, I will put that in there. So actually, Dave, that's a very good idea. In the future, for best practices, I will start doing that. So thank you for the suggestion, Dave. Will the event be streamed or recorded? It won't be recorded to the extent of my knowledge. However, there is an event book that will be available for purchase, wherein everyone's written speech, their bibliography and such, all of that will be available to buy. So even if you can't be there, the actual speech themselves will be available. And then the art contest, it's all due tomorrow. For those of you who have been interested, I know that quite a few people asked me via DMs and email. So it's due on the 31st. I'll announce probably next Sunday. And whoever is the winner will be given $100 USD. And then new Substack out this Thursday. I'll be continuing my conversation on Ukraine. So I guess a little prep for Imperium Cast for you all to read. And I'll be a little less acerbic than my last initial observations on the subject, because a lot has happened and there's still a lot of people hyping things up. So we will be well on our way to address the issues and questions. But on to the fun part. Alrighty, so as I promised, I was going to do 2 frogs of the week in order to ensure that we make up for last Sunday. And yes, Raging Mandrill. You know what I will do for that is I will just bring up all of the submissions and rally them up, and we'll just have that there. And yes, I know it's in sync for once. I fixed the audio issue, Chally Chieftain, so don't worry about it. And Zachary, those are just stuff that I had. I found gifs of frogs dancing and such. I thought they were cute. But this one is the Spanish painted frog. We're going to have 2 frogs within the Iberian Peninsula today. And it is the Spanish painted frog, known for its toad-like appearances. And and we will have it all there for us to talk about. I just read the super chat. I'll get to that in a second. But he's very toad-like creature, but he's an actual frog. Known for their bright white or yellow underbellies, they are best associated with the dark brown spots in their light brown skin, and they are densely populated within southern Spain, but they can reach all the way up to northern Spain in this very thin, narrow branch of habitat, valid habitats for them, habitation throughout eastern Spain that can reach all the way up to the eastern parts of the Pyrenees Mountains. Most of its activities will be done at night. They're not considered nocturnal animals, but that's when most of their busy work and mating and eating gets done. But unlike a lot of frogs within winter areas and places that can get particularly cold, is that it doesn't hibernate or burrow itself underground for a specific period of time, probably due to the fact that it's usually in southern Spain, close to Gibraltar. And then, of course, it primarily eats insects and worms, but it has been known to eat smaller toads and frogs as well. And it prefers to usually have their spawn within various streams, usually buried under roots and things, so that when they hatch, they can, eat on the various plant and vegetation stuff that's there. So let me go get to that since we're talking about Portugal. Winston Fujimori says, I just got here. Can you restart the stream? Don't worry. You can just start from the very beginning and just play it on 2x speed. Also, Chega poised to win big in Portugal today. So if you were a football fan, and more importantly, a Chega fan, there you go. But here we go on to the next frog. And like I said, we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula. And so now we're talking about the Iberian frog. 2 different species. They are found within the swamps, streams, and ponds of both Spain and Portugal, primarily in the northwestern parts of both countries. They are endemic. You cannot find them anywhere else but here. And unfortunately, they're listed as an invasive and threatened species due to invasive species, various contaminants, and they are very, very sensitive to ultraviolet radiation. So there are UV light that can come on in the UV radiation from the sun. So, the ozone and things like that do play a major role in this frog's ability to live and, most importantly, mate, because various degrees of UV radiation, from what I read, can affect how well the tadpoles develop while they're still sort of in that egg stage. And like most frogs and amphibians, they are all sexually dimorphic, and this one can be a little smaller. This one's about just under 3 inches for the females from the snout to its rear, not including when the legs are folded back up there. But they do remind me of cricket frogs, to be honest, based on this picture. But their metamorphosis takes quite a while. It takes about 3 months to become juvenile frogs, just like the painted, frog from earlier. They're a little different, where they also plant their eggs underneath roots and habitation, usually in streams or ponds or places with higher levels of humidity. And when they grow up, when they hatch, so to speak, they start munching on the various plant detritus and vegetation and roots in the area. But it does take them a little bit longer to become juvenile frogs. It takes them about 3 months. And that is both the Iberian frog and the Spanish painted frog. That is our frog of the week there, ladies and gents. And of course, I'll just catch up with all of you. And thank you again to the wonderful people on Subscribestar, my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more a month. You guys make sure that my medications stay affordable and not out of any out-of-pocket costs. Things like that. Oh, it's a political party. Well, that explains my ignorance. It's a political party. Chega's supposed to win the electorate and the elections today. Are they a right-wing party? That would be the question I would have to ask. And which side were they on with the Spanish Civil War? I've been told that they rode along with Peter Kemp, Charlemagne, so don't worry. Glow in the Dark says that they're Portuguese right-wing, not full Deus Patria Rei based, but pretty good for how paused Portugal is. Well, good to know. Awesome. Wonderful. Well, if they're expected to win pretty big today, then congratulations to the Portuguese for what I think is the right decision. But yeah, that was a very fun and intense lecture today. It's very dense stuff from what I was reading, but I will link the authors and whatnot, putting them all in the description at the end. Fujimori says that Chega is a right-wing nationalist party. Well, then good for Portugal. Good on them. That top tier list is displayed in descending order. Looking at their names, I wonder if I could make something spelled out here. But these guys all donate $20 a month or more. So yeah, these guys make sure that my medications are affordable, that I can afford paying for the StreamYard stuff so I can record things and go live if I ever need to. And you guys all make it happen. The views, the likes, the algorithm, the sharing, I'm totally indebted to you all, and I'm thankful for it. You guys get to listen to some guy that read way too many books talk about what he reads, and so I'm very thankful for that. Always will be. Tuesday says, if John D starts a YouTube channel, he'll have to do Horse of the Week. I don't think there are as many horse species that he could probably pull off for that to happen unless he starts going by individual horses that he just finds to be aesthetically pleasing. But we'll be taking care of that in just a second. I'll pass that by to him. Other than that, though, no, it was nice to do all of that stuff last week with the various streams, 4 in 2 days and things like that. No, it went really well. I don't know how people do it with the camera on, though. Good Lord, that's exhausting. Tuesday asks, how was it last Sunday? Well, I'm not one to do the whole kissing and telling thing, but it went well. She was very nice. A little younger than I am, which kind of threw me off, but she was nice. Charlie Chieftain, I intended something else for a top tier list, but that got lost in translation. Oh, I could do like a frog tier list. That would be a fun stream. But yes, as we get to the end for today's conversation and lecture, I hope that you all have a very pleasant Sunday. And be sure to, stay in tune for future streams and whatnot. Next Sunday will be on Ukraine and things like that. And yeah, so Charlemagne says, I don't like the cam on because I'm constantly smirking at funny thoughts that enter my head like Sam Hyde. Oh, the reason why I don't have it on right now is because this has allowed me to message back on like Telegram or retweet stuff. And oh, look at that. The person that got ratioed from the trucker stuff deleted their tweet. That's delightful. But yeah, Sunny Side Up asks me, when is part 2 of Ben-Hur? Well, that's going to be a little dependent on everyone's scheduling, because Gio, of course, is a very busy man with his art and Break the Rules. And Furious is, of course, in Australia. And I know he's got some things going on. And so it'll probably be a little while from now. But trust me, I had a lot of fun talking about that movie. They all did as well. And we'll have it in the future. Don't worry, I've not forgotten. But in the meantime, though, I will have some movie reviews up in the meantime. So I'll probably do Ben-Hur first, which is another benefit of patrons. If you want to see what movies I'm reviewing or what I'm going to be working on in the future, then yeah, there's going to be various patron-related events once a month where we either hang out, we play various video games together, or we watch films that I'll eventually review and things like that. So all sorts of stuff. So yeah, all plenty of fun things happening in the future. But until then, I think it is going to be, I didn't put this on my list, but the weekend of the 12th and the 13th, there will most likely not be a show. I will be with a buddy of mine, actually, and we're probably going to go fishing and hanging out. So he's a fellow creator, Oros Post. So if you don't subscribe to him, I believe he had a very good conversation today with a gentleman in the military talking about the politics of the Army. But yeah, he and I will be out fishing and stuff, so it'll be a good time. So yeah, that's what I've got for you all, and more to come, as always, in the future. And thank you to everybody who makes this all possible. And I'll just conclude by saying, do like, share, subscribe, the usual shilling stuff. And until then, I will see you all next Sunday. Take care and be prudent.